sluggish, especially when we're told all the time that we're supposed to be running a free market economy and that the state should not have control over the economy. We're told that the private sector is the one that will bring growth. So why do we always blame the government when the economy is sluggish?
I mean, I think probably part of it has to do with our history. For a long time, our economy was centrally controlled by the government under the military era. And fundamentally, a lot of things have not changed about the way people think about Nigeria's economy. Usually, we always ask for government intervention when prices of things are too high. Easiest way to look at this is the petroleum product subsidies we have for refined petroleum products. So the government does have its hands in so many aspects of the economy currently, which is why we tend to think about the government when we think about the economy. So I think in the ideal situation, yes, the economy will be mainly private sector driven, but we are in the current situation where the government plays a huge role in the economy and not just the private sector.
Now, we're streaming this conversation on Facebook and YouTube, Twitter as well, at Nigeria Info FM. So feel free to watch us live. Cheta, I wonder if you agree with Andy and Ebehi.
Basically, it's government's job to, there's this thing. Economic stimulus is provided by the government anywhere in the world, even in the US, which is as capitalist as it gets. It is government that provides the policies and provides the regulations by which the private sector plays. So government's job is to provide an enabling environment and then get out of the way. If government does not provide an enabling environment, which we see very clearly in Nigeria all the time, then the private sector cannot thrive. So that is, at the end of the day, that is the government's main job. And the government, because they own the stick and they own the carrots, they can actually mess things up by one policy misstep. Just a single policy misstep can create a domino effect that will affect everything. So as an example, a practical example in Nigeria, you have a policy where the government says, okay, nobody should get foreign exchange to import rice. But the same government has not provided the necessary infrastructure across the country for storage of rice, for milling of rice, security of rice planters, and then roads or rail infrastructure to move rice from the production centers to the consumption centers. So how would the policy work? Net effect of that is, at the end of the day, little Benin Republic with 1/20th of our population imports 6 times the amount of rice that we import officially. Of course, it doesn't.
Doesn't tally, yeah.
It doesn't. You don't need to be Dr. Seuss to know where that rice ends up. So that's a classic example of how.
Yeah, but for the sake of the Dr. Seuss's that are not listening to the show, where does the rice end up?
I have no idea.
Let me come to Andy. What control does government actually have over the economy?
Well, I think Ibehi and Cheta have really painted a picture here. Government has control by spending, that's a stimulus. Government can influence the economy that way by how it spends. Government can also influence the economy through its fiscal policy in general, which is the spending, and then also regulation. So that's what the Ministry of Finance does. It makes financial regulations, and then there's spending. Then there's the other aspect of government's control, which is monetary policy by the CBN. So we don't like to see the CBN as government, because when we say government in Nigeria, our mind goes to the president. But government is larger than just one institution. The CBN, one arm. The CBN controls the money supply, monetary policy, and that also affects the economy because it determines interest rates, it determines the level of inflation, and those things affect economic activity, spending, saving, and all of that. So those are the main tools government has. Alan Greenspan famously said that it's like controlling an aircraft carrier using a paddle. It's you have this massive thing called the economy, and you have these very small levers that you can use to control it, and that's what.
And that's basically how that is. Ebehi, let me come to you. Who's in charge of government's economic policy? Where does the buck stop?
So the thing is, government is a complicated machinery, right? So technically, not one individual is responsible. So let's think about where we usually look at is the president, right? The executive arm. We think, okay, executive arm chooses economic advisors, chooses the minister for finance, chooses the minister for budget and planning, which have a huge impact on fiscal policy. But then also, it also stops at National Assembly because they approve the budget.
Okay.
They approve our appropriations, and they also have a huge role to play in fiscal policy. So I guess it's a combination of them working together and supposed to be balancing each other out in terms of who is ultimately responsible. But the most active actors, right, are the executive people appointed by the president, economic advisors, because at the end of the day, that's most of the day-to-day running that happens through the ministries and through the civil service as far as how fiscal policy is ultimately implemented.
Cheta, the Jonathan administration had a position called coordinating minister for the economy, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who was finance minister. She held that position. In Buhari's first term, that position did not exist. What exactly is a coordinating minister for the economy, and what are the pros and cons of having or not having one?
Well, I'm not going to enter into former President Jonathan's mind when he made that decision. Okay. However, I will tell a brief anecdote on how that came to be. During the second term of President Obasanjo, it became pretty clear very quickly that we needed someone to basically coordinate all the disparate ministries that we had together, so that they will be singing from the same hymn sheets. Remember that you mentioned earlier that we have a Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Labor, this and that. We have too many ministries in the country. But then it's something that we cannot help. It's in our prime law, the Constitution. We have to have this number of ministries so that all of you people will not feel marginalized. So when Obasanjo was having a second term, it became clear that there needed to be someone, a sort of the equivalent of the Treasury Secretary in the US. Remember, they have just 12 departments, which is the equivalent of ministry there, or the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK. Just that kind of equivalent. Somebody who everybody else kind of reported to, even if theoretically they were all at cabinet level. So when Jonathan took over after the late President Yar'Adua died, it was basically on that premise, and he was advised to take Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala because of the stellar job she had done with the whole Paris Club thing. And she, having gone back to the World Bank at that time, kind of said that she wasn't coming back. So they dangled that carrot in front of her. And given that she had been promised control of the economy in terms of that everybody would be plugged through her, she took it. I think that considering where we are as a country, it was a great idea. If not there were still some people who were kind of untouchable. So you had the Minister of Petroleum. They were still, there were things that she couldn't do. But remember,
she also didn't control the CBN.
Well, the point was, for a very long time, herself and Sanusi, who was the governor of the CBN, were actually getting along and working in harmony for quite a while. Sanusi didn't exactly fall out with her. It was with the people around Jonathan himself that's the falling out. So Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala and Sanusi actually worked quite well together because they were largely singing from the same hymn sheet.
So she basically was in charge of fiscal policy, regulatory policy. She chaired the Economic Council. She met with the ministers whose portfolios touched the economy. She coordinated their efforts. That was basically what that was.
Yes, and if you look at the graph of Nigeria's growth rate over the last 10 years, it was during that period when she was in charge. that we had the highest growth rates. So the highest growth rates in our history were during Obasanjo's second term.
Okay.
Yeah, but the second highest growth. Okay, so there are three epochs that we've had in our history since 1960 in terms of Nigerian growth rates. The highest in our history was Obasanjo's second term. Second highest was what we now call the oil boom, and then the third highest was that period from 2010 up until oil prices began to collapse towards the end of 2013.
Andy, what are the pros and cons of having this one person coordinating all of these things?
Well, Cheta has really laid out the pros in the sense that you have one person ultimately responsible, coordinating the economy, coordinating every other minister whose brief or whose portfolio overlaps with the economy. And so you have a single hymn sheet for economic policy. So that makes things very, very easy in terms of we're not all going in different directions. So that allows the government to frame or shape policies that are cohesive. So that's the main pro. The con is the politics, because these are, after all ministers, all technically equal under the law, and all with their own spheres of responsibility. And then, of course, there's the human angle, egos, clashes. When you read what Dr. Kojoriela has to write about her time as minister, you see that coming through both between the lines and in the lines themselves that she wrote. So you have that issue. And it's especially true when it's a fellow minister. It's a peer. And it's especially true if perhaps the president, who is the only person who can resolve an issue between ministers, is not willing to put his or her foot down. So it becomes an issue of, well, the president is, the coordinating minister of the economy is ultimately responsible, but is really not ultimately responsible because everybody still has access to the president. So as long as these things are not enshrined, as long as there isn't a law or a provision in the constitution, these arrangements are ad hoc, and ad hoc arrangements have a tendency to, fray, to, fall apart at the seams when, human beings with their various agendas are forced or required to work within these ad hoc arrangements. So, while it's very good to have a coordinating minister of the economy, it would be much better if it was just a minister of the economy, not a coordinating
minister.
It's like herding cats.
All of this is because Nigerians simply don't do humble. I mean, it's purely an ego thing. There's a concept in civilized places that is called primus inter pares, first among equals. Provided we achieve the goal, all these egos, move them aside.
Let me come to Ebehi for a minute. So the government has a plan, Ebehi, to increase growth. I'm going to get your thoughts on what Cheta and Andy have talked about with this coordinating minister bit. But I want to get your thoughts first on the ERGP, right? It's contained in a policy document, the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan. I'm talking about the government's plan to increase growth, right? It's meant to, Cheta is smiling very sinisterly, it's meant to be the guideline for the federal government's economic policy. Now, the ERGP says that number one, it will restabilize the economy by stabilizing the macroeconomic environment, achieving agriculture and food security, ensuring energy sufficiency.
Amen.
That's power and petroleum products. Can you stop saying amen? We've got number 4 there, improving transportation infrastructure. We've got driving industrialization.
Okay, it's enough. Stop. She knows the content. She knows the content.
Yeah, but my listeners don't. There's also driving industrialization, focusing on small and medium enterprise, scale enterprises. How well, Ebehi, has the government implemented ERGP so far?
So if you go by, I just had to laugh. If you go by the propaganda, and I think that's the best word for it, we're doing really great, right? We appear to be very sufficient in food production, apparently. But
you don't think we are? You don't think we're...
Let her. She's in America. She can talk freely.
Oh.
So going by propaganda, yes, we're doing great. But actually, let's look at one of the key aspects of this whole plan, which is job creation and youth empowerment. Okay.
I knew that's where you
So
go ahead.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh,
No.
sorry.
Go
Did
ahead.
I?
No.
Okay.
Go
I
ahead.
wasn't sure.
Go ahead.
So let's look at that. So our current. So the goal of the plan is basically by 2020 to have 11.23% unemployment versus 13.9% as at 2016. Correct? Are we on track to actually achieve that? Well, so here's the thing. We implement, or rather the government, I don't want to include myself in this, but Nigeria as a collective we implement programs such as Trader Money, for example, and these Band-Aid programs to basically temporarily shift people from unemployment to underemployment, right? And so that technically reduces unemployment figures. But then at the same time, our underemployment is rising. So I don't think, so if you just go by, okay, it is to reduce unemployment to 11%, I think we will achieve that by 2020. Well, we can simply achieve that by increasing underemployment, right? So fundamentally, are we changing the structure of the economy? No, I don't think so.
Yeah, but what? Okay. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. So I don't think we're fundamentally changing the structure of the economy, because by Band-Aid job creation programs, what we're really doing is just taking people out of that definition of I am currently unemployed looking for a job to I am currently employed in a job that doesn't, or in self-employment that doesn't actually cater for even subsistence needs, right? So are real wages rising? Not so much, especially if, although I do need to look at the latest inflation figures to see if we're even on track with that. But yeah, so I don't think we're on track to actually achieve the goals of the plan for 2020.
All right, so Andy wanted to say something.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the ERGP put down a lot of goals. Some of them, reasonable. Some of them already from reading at the paper were unachievable from the beginning. Talking about what was it? Is it 20,000 megawatts by 2020 in electricity?
Yeah, and your chief say just talk.
So the truth of the matter is that from the very beginning, the ERGP was unrealistic. Now, apart from being unrealistic, when I say it's unrealistic, it meant that if government were working at full tilt, the Nigerian government working at full tilt, it would have been very difficult, maybe impossible, to meet all the goals of the ERGP. And that's if government were working at full tilt. But the truth of the matter is that government has not been working at full tilt. We have a situation where, so let's talk about power, for instance. You set this goal for power, 20,000 megawatts by 2020. 2020 is next year. We're struggling to stay above 4,000.
But we have that deal coming with Siemens.
So was the ERGP just built around this deal with Siemens? And then also now the question now becomes, well, what is Siemens seeing that all the other investors in power have not seen? Because the investors in power are saying the same thing over and over. The tariff structure does not work. You cannot make a profit. In fact, you cannot even keep your business afloat in power.
Can I interrupt?
You cannot interrupt
about
the
Hold on.
guy, those things don't matter.
Cheta, I'm going to come back to you. Hold on.
This Siemens thing.
Yes.
Had it not been that President Buhari visited Frau Merkel, the Siemens thing won't have happened. Let's be honest with ourselves.
Yes, we're going to come back to that point.
They won't have touched us with a long
Yes, it's a high-level political discussion.
So
that
let's
took
get
place.
but back to the point you were making.
So now with power, so obviously right off the gate, we have a regulatory issue with power, a regulatory problem. People will not put their money into a sector that is not profitable. And the major thing, I'm not saying the only thing, but the major thing making power not profitable are the tariffs. So this is a low-hanging fruit relatively for government. Fix the tariff structure. But government is not doing that. But government is insisting that by some magic, by 2020, we will have 20,000 megawatts.
So you're not very optimistic about Siemens, huh?
I am quite pessimistic about it. I'm willing to see. So, but that's just power. Then you have in other issues, and it's like Ebehi is saying, we're just moving people from unemployment to underemployment. Sandra, you said at the top of the show that our population growth rate is higher than our GDP growth rate. And this is not the first year this has been the case. This is happening year on year. And in simple terms, that means the number of people sharing the pie is growing larger than the pie. So everybody is getting poorer, relatively speaking. And this is because we just simply don't have I hate to use the cliche, the enabling environment for business to invest and create jobs. That's what it comes down to.
Okay, we need to take a quick break and then we'll come back. But before the break, Ebehi, I told you that I wanted to hear your thoughts on a controlling minister for the economy or lack thereof. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think, again, there's a first best solution, which is that the economy the country wouldn't need one, right? Because if we put politics and egos aside and we only focus on are we trying to get the economy from where it is now to somewhere better and improve people's lives, then should it really matter what titles people have? So that's a first best solution, right?
Okay.
But I do think a coordinating minister for the economy is a second best solution, given what we know about the way the country functions right now. The fact that egos do matter, the fact that politics does happen. It is a useful, gives that extra bit of clout to someone hopefully competent, which is the key thing here. You need someone competent, right? To basically have a person saying, okay, at the end of the day, this person has slightly more authority than the rest of the cabinet, and what they say should be taken with greater weight. Because I think one of the things we've seen in the last 4 years has been the Minister of Labour saying one thing about what the government is planning to do, and the Minister of Information saying something completely different. And I think it's something that could be avoided with a coordinating minister for the economy.
All right, let's take that break. Come back and talk about agriculture. You're listening to the Big Hard Fact on Hard Facts. I'm Sandra Ezekwesili. I have a guest from SBM Intelligence. He's in big data. His name is Chetawanze. I have a guest who's a policy analyst, but he's ventured off into venture capitalism. And he's also a chief, Andrew Boforibo. And I also have an economist, Behi Iyoha, whose voice you just heard. Don't go away.
Hard Facts. We'll be right back.
Tuesday, we're taking a look at the different portfolios that President Buhari will announce. There's no minister for the economy, but we're taking a look at the economy, and we're taking a look at all of the ministries and agencies whose job it will be to make sure that Nigeria's economy stays stable. I have an expert in big data on the show. He's with SBM Intelligence. Chetanwanz is here. Chief Andrew Boforibo is a policy analyst who's also on the show. Ebehi Iyoha is an economist, and she's from Steers Business, and she has joined us all the way from America today. And we're all having this conversation. If you missed the first half, not to worry, you can catch up when we're done on Facebook and YouTube. Ebehi, I want to talk to you about agriculture because there seems to be a bit of a paradox. We're talking about modernizing and mechanizing agriculture to make it more productive. You and I have talked about agriculture so many times on this show. Wouldn't that mean fewer jobs? If modern agriculture reduces jobs, if it does mean fewer jobs, what are its benefits?
So yes, in the long term, this is like a hill I am willing to die on because in the long term, agriculture will not be the solution to our unemployment problem. That's just a fact because the more productive agriculture gets, the fewer people are employed. However, in the medium term, there is some potential to increase employment in the agricultural sector at the same time as increasing productivity. So if, for example, you increase labor productivity within the agricultural sector before going full commercialization, there is some short-term benefits to encouraging people to go into agriculture. But the main reason why countries usually focus on the agricultural sector isn't necessarily because of its impact on unemployment. It's just this idea of food is one of the basic things that people need to survive, and if our economy is dependent on food from other countries, then they can hold us hostage. So it's this kind of security idea that our nation's sovereignty is kind of tied to our ability to produce food for ourselves, which isn't necessarily based on sound economic principles, but more on an idea of self-sufficiency. But at the same time, the other thing that people are looking at is, okay, right now the agricultural sector does employ a large proportion of the population, but they're not making a lot of money from it. So can we at least in the short term increase how much money they make from agriculture before eventually agriculture becomes more mechanized and people move out of agriculture into other sectors? So that's also the angle people are looking at things at. But for the long term, as a long-term goal, as a long-term plan, thinking of agriculture as a solution to employing people is just not sound.
Cheta, is this something you agree with?
I agree, and there are things that I'd like to add to it as a matter of fact.
Okay.
So, number one, if we take, say, one of the most productive countries in the world in terms of agriculture, Israel, 3.4% of Israel's population is engaged in direct agriculture. Leads me to something that we don't talk about often when we talk about agriculture in this country, which is the agricultural value chain. So most people, when you talk about agriculture in Nigeria, most people think, and that starts from our president, they think in terms of you carrying your hoe and going to the field, and then coming back at the end of 9 months with your ugu leaves. We don't seem to realize that for example, Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, between them, produce 75% of the world's cocoa. Yet, they were not getting enough value from it, such that a few months ago they tried to raise the price of raw cocoa. The country which is getting the real value from cocoa is Switzerland. Why? Because they do a lot of the processing. So those kind of things, it's about value add. And again, the real question, the real thing that can lift our people from poverty is not this labor-intensive kind of going to the farm from like Okonkwo from morning to evening and with your back bent and then coming back. No, the real money to be made, which will lift our people out of poverty and provide employment, is in providing the infrastructure, silos, enough silos such that when you harvest tomato in Kano, you can keep it there, stored until it's ready to go to the market. not the one that we have. I've forgotten the exact figure, but a very high proportion of our harvested produce goes to waste. Why? Because we don't have storage facilities. This whole nonsense we're having with the pastoral conflicts, farmers and herdsmen. Part of the problem is the fact that we are not even practicing herding properly the way it should be. Nigerian cattle have among the lowest yields anywhere in the world. Why? Because our cattle are physically fit. Why? They keep trekking all over the place. Whereas you go to Holland or Belgium, France.
So our
all
cattle
those
should not be physically fit. I don't know. I just had to ask because go ahead.
What are you selling cattle for? You are selling it for the meat,
not
fat,
the muscle.
not the. If we want to eat lean meat, we're going to catch tilapia. So,
wait. So you're saying we can't get fat from Nigerian cattle?
the data is there. They have among the lowest yields. Even milk, they don't even produce as much milk because it is conversion of fats that's I've forgotten the name of the process, but there's a process for converting fat to milk. So we have very low production of milk, very low production of beef, and then we have, because of another thing that government is supposed to do, which is security, we don't have it. So because of that, I have personally spoken to people in places like Benue who haven't been to their farms to harvest in years, again because of this pastoral conflict. So it's one thing to say, oh, we want to do this, we want to do this. If you look at the numbers in terms of what Nigeria has been spending for per year for food importation, aside from a major spike in 2011, the numbers came down again in 2012, went up again in 2013, and then following the fall of oil prices, it went down, but it has been going up steadily. Why has it been going up steadily? Because simple and short, we are not food secure. We cannot meet the needs of our population. So it's time for us to get our heads out of the clouds, focus. The Netherlands cracked this thing of beef production and selling it the same day or the next day or whatever in the 19th century. Why is it that in the 21st century you cannot kill a cow in Kano and then sell fresh beef in Lagos the next day?
Andrew Bofrebo, you're the venture capital executive in the conversation. The president said that we have food security. Is this something you put your money on?
I'll put my money on the opposite. The data is there. I don't know why nobody opened The Economist for the president and showed him The Economist Food Security Index, which is produced every year.
There's only one cartoon in The
Economist. The 2018 Food Security Index said that Nigeria is ranked, I believe it was 96th in the world out of 113. 96th in terms of food security. Okay, you can say, okay, maybe our food security is good, but 95 countries had better. But no. Our actual score was 38% overall. Our score for, I can't remember what our scores were for affordability and availability, but both were below 50%.
Well, speak to affordability. The average Nigerian spends 58% of his earnings on food,
and that is a
situation the highest in the world.
That is a situation that is just simply not sustainable. Now, what is the government's response to this? The government's response is to ban importation of food in a hope that it will boost agricultural production. Leave aside the fact that we're not the Soviet Union. We should have learned from the Soviet Union that import substitution does not work. We should have learned by now that these things just don't work. You cannot, because you stop imports, that doesn't trigger a growth in local production. It just doesn't work that way. Local producers are very happy. They will thank you for giving them a monopoly, and they may or may not decide to increase production. But leaving that aside,
they will marry new wives.
Let me use an example.
Okay.
An anecdote from Nigerian history.
Okay.
My Nigerian history, my people. I'm a chief in Okrika, an Ijaw community.
Mm-hmm.
Now, our people historically, the time of our greatest prosperity was when we were trading with the Europeans. And now we're trading at one point, we're trading palm oil. Now, we're trading palm oil, and almost our entire productive labor force was involved in the palm oil trade, buying palm kernels from the hinterland and processing it into palm oil and then selling it on. There was almost zero food production in Okrika and Kalabari and kingdoms like that at a time that they were thriving. They were importing all their food because they were making enough money from international trade that they didn't need to produce food locally anymore. And that should be the prayer point of any nation, that you are making so much money from a diversified economy, diversified exports, that you can import anything you need. We wouldn't even be having this conversation about where our food comes from, whether we're growing it with our hoes or whether we're importing it with our forex, if we had a robust, buoyant economy that was exporting enough things that the rest of the world needs to give us enough forex to buy as much food as we want. We have a situation now where China and the US are engaged in a very foolish trade war. And China is now American farmers are screaming and begging Trump to cool down because China is banning imports of American food. China, the second largest economy in the world, is reliant on American agricultural produce. They're importing more food than they're producing. But it's not a problem for China. They're number 2 in the world. They will soon be number 1 in the world. So why is it a problem for Nigeria? I think we need to get out of this rural and non-metropolitan way of thinking about the economy, where you have to eat, you can only eat what you grow. It's just, well, it's wrong-headed.
Okay, I'm going to give you a chance to call into the show. Leave us comments on Facebook as well. Nigeria Info FM. We're streaming this conversation. You can see my guests and leave comments about some of the thoughts that they've been sharing. Our numbers are 01277 0993, 01277 1993, 01277 2993, and 01277 3993. When we started this conversation, I said that we don't have a single ministry of the economy. There are multiple ministries that handle the different parts of the economy, and we're looking at the role that all of them have to play. We've talked a bit about finance. We've talked kind of about the Ministry of Industry, Trade and Investment. We just talked about agriculture, and I want us to talk about labor. I'm coming to you now, Ebehi. We have an employment problem in Nigeria. Let's talk job creation. The unemployment rate is climbing. I know that we need to stimulate the manufacturing sector, the service sector, including tech. What does government need to do to help the manufacturing sector grow and create more jobs?
So the funny thing is, we do need to increase the manufacturing sector, but the things that we need are really basic, right? So electricity, security, and transportation. And it seems like those are very basic things, but again, they seem to be complicated for Nigeria. The key issue, for example, is electricity has actually improved in some areas. For example, areas in Abuja have much more stable electricity than you could say even 3-4 years ago. Actually, you could have up to 12 hours per day and could reasonably predict when electricity is going to be available. So there is some improvement, but then how much industrial activity has increased in Abuja as a result? That's an empirical question.
Where the elites live.
But the key, yes, but there's a lot of issues with Abuja as far as, for example, the cost of production will be high because of real estate prices, right? Because that's where a lot of the political money goes. But anyway, that aside, the point is the government needs to focus on the fundamentals of, again, that cliche phrase, enabling environment, but really that's what it is. Focus on the fundamentals of what the businesses need to succeed. But I think the approach the government currently is taking is, what can I do to employ people, which is completely the opposite of what we should be doing. So, for example, I keep coming back to ports, but that's my thing. Calabar Port, we need to basically, if we had, for example, developed industrial zones close to ports so that transportation is less of an issue as far as export-oriented industries, then, first of all, we decrease congestion in Lagos, but then we also stimulate activity in other parts of the country. These are basic things. But then the other thing we also have to think of is how hostile is the regulatory environment. So very clear example is the new increase in Okada and alternative transportation initiatives in Lagos, for example, GoKada, etc. And then the imposition of these new fines and fees to basically these businesses that are about to start employing a bunch of people. But then all of a sudden, before the gains in employment can even realize, we have the government imposing these fines. And of course, there might be environmental reasons to think about how to do this efficiently and optimally. But the idea is that the government our government currently seems very extractive. So instead of enabling business, it seems to be extracting from business. So how can we get government revenue? How can customs increase its revenue versus how can the government enable the economy grow and eventually get more revenue from a bigger economy?
All
so
right.
It's like the government stifles the economy, stifles private sector a lot of the time rather than helping it grow and flourish.
Okay, let me take 2 calls. I'm going to give you 30 seconds each to make your point or ask your question. Then I'll come to Cheta about the service sector.
Yeah.
Hello, what's your name?
Hello, good evening. My name is Kingsley. I'm calling from Sule.
Kingsley, go ahead, 30 seconds.
Yeah, good evening, Sandra,
Yes.
and the rest of the analysts. You see, I want to thank Nigeria Info. The kind of analysts you guys bring in. By this time every day, I'm always happy because you educate Nigerians and me on how the economy is supposed to be run. Look at how Cheta with the other guy and the other lady just analyze Nigerian economy, how to get out of the wood. In Singapore, these are the kind of eggheads that mount their ministries, that when they begin to implement policies, people will begin to come out of poverty. By then, I won't be concerned about who is the president and who is the vice president. And even Cheta, that's like in America, they shrink their cabinet to 12. You can even have 10 parastatals being run by able and capable men, and Nigeria will be moving forward.
All right.
And I don't need to be saying this one from here to be the president.
Okay.
I'm too happy with the analysis.
I've given you more than 30
I'm
seconds.
happy.
You're happy with the analysis. I'm glad I was able to bring them to help you be happy. I love making you happy. Let's talk to Devo. Devo, I'm going to be strict with the 30 seconds now. Hello.
Yes, Sandra.
Yes,
to me,
welcome.
just 3 things I want to say.
Okay.
If only the government can fix our refineries,
Okay.
which is the main problem.
Okay.
If they can fix, because it's the cover up issue of exchange rate. And then number 2, Ajakuta Steel Complex. Once it comes in, there's no kind of car that will not manufacture in Nigeria.
Okay.
There's nothing that is metal, even importation, that will not manufacture. Nothing.
Okay.
And then number 3, the issue of even agriculture. Government should look at the way we just passed last year when the herdsmen were killing all over. Now the president is making a statement that there's sufficient food. For where?
Okay. And he did it in 30 seconds. 3 points, 30 seconds. I like guests like Devo. We should all be like Devo. Now, Cheta, the service sector makes over 55% of Nigeria's GDP. But its growth has been sluggish in the last few years. What can government do to stimulate it?
Get out of the way.
Cheta, please.
End of story. There's so okay. An example that I like to give.
Can you give it in 1 minute, 30 seconds?
An example that I like to give is the best run airport in Nigeria, because airports fall under services. The best run airport in Nigeria is MM2. No doubt about it. It should be our international airport, not that embarrassment down the road. But what has the government been doing? For the past 6-7 years at least, there has been lawsuit upon, as in Bicotney has been taking government to court, lawsuit upon lawsuit. The government is trying to get Bicotney out of it so that they will run it and then run it into the ground like a GATT or MMIA. So one of the key problems or one of the key issues in Nigeria that we don't talk about is the fact that we have 2 schools of thought. The school of thought that thinks that the private sector should lead the way and the government should remove its hand. I'll call it the Obasanjo school of thought, because it was under Obasanjo that the regulation started. And then we have the Buhari school of thought, which feels that the government should be the one that should run everything. And they are locked in a struggle. I'm solidly with the Obasanjo school of thought. Governments should only provide the enabling environment and move away. Otherwise, the effect is people naturally, when they don't see a future, when they see big government trying to get in their way in everything, naturally they will hoard money. And once people start hoarding money, they call it savings or preparing for the rainy day. Once people start hoarding money, services naturally die. Think about it. After all the fines that were plunged on MTN, have you Project Fame? When was the last one they did? Those are little things that actually had the knock-on effect of percolating to other parts of the economy.
Let's go back to the phone lines now. We've got Walter who's been calling us. Walter, you've got 30 seconds. Welcome.
Okay, good afternoon.
Yes, go ahead.
This is Walter calling from Victoria Island. The truth is that when you look at Nigeria, those analysts are doing a great job today, and I'm very happy listening to them. But let me just get straight to my own point. The point is electricity. Why are we running a single grid electricity in this country? Why can't the state be allowed to generate, transmit, and possibly sell it to the distribution company within their own state so that there can be production? That's one. Two, all these mineral resources, since we don't want to do resource control, all the minerals we have all over the country that we are not exploiting, we are not exploring today, they will be obsolete in 60 years, in 50 years. Are we thinking about that? At that point, we will now remember that, say, a certain set of Nigerians were asking for resource control because the federal government is totally incompetent. They can't manage the resources. You just look at anything. Have they managed anything right?
Walter, thanks for calling and sharing your thoughts. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so I had to cut you off. And now I'm going to take closing thoughts. Low-hanging fruits that you think the MDAs whose jobs it is to take care of Nigeria's economy. What low-hanging fruits can they pluck? I bet I'll start with you.
So I think definitely, power is a big one, but really I think for transportation, the key thing is railways. Get our railways up and running, and not for passenger transport, freight railways for transporting goods across the country. I think that is a very big priority. I don't think it's hard to achieve, and it would be hard to achieve within even a reasonable amount of time, even going by, for example, China's example of building thousands of kilometers of railways within less than a decade. So that's my
your low-hanging fruit. Big low-hanging fruit.
My low-hanging fruit.
Cheta as well?
Well, she said because I've shouted about transportation for a long time. If we can't get things from... When the British decided to colonize us, one of the first projects that they did was to build railways from Kara Namuda to Port Harcourt, from Onguru to Lagos. Important. Which brings us to the second part of it, the ports. Nigeria has 6 ports, 2 in Lagos, 4 in other parts of the country. Effectively, it is only the 2 in Lagos that are ports. You can't have a country of almost 1 million square kilometers, allegedly 200 million people, and then effectively 1 entry point. It's no surprise that the roads out of Lagos are clogged, or that we have the whole Apapa thing, which seems to be abating, but I think it's just bandit that they put over, but that's another discussion entirely. So ports, we need Calabar, Port Harcourt, Warri up and on air, up and running like yesterday.
All right, Andrew, you're the last person.
Scrap the petrol subsidy. Take the money that you save from the petrol subsidy and the money you take from also deregulating the power sector and stop subsidizing tariffs. Take that money, put it into education, so that we have people who can work in the economy of today, the 21st century economy. Take a bit more of that money and put it into like the infrastructure, like I said, for transportation, the ports and the railways. Then get out of the way where you can get out of the way. So, for instance, don't bother yourself about food imports anymore. Remove tariffs and protections on all these imports. Let people import what they want and allow the economy to move in the direction it's supposed to.
All right. If you missed this conversation, you just tuned in. Well, good news. You can catch up on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter at Nigeria Info FM. I've had a venture capital executive, Chief Andrew Boforibo, on the show. I've had a big data expert, Cheta Wanze from SBM Intelligence. And I've had Ebehi Iyoha. She's joined us on the phone from the US, and she is an economist with Steers Business. Ebehi, thank you so much for making the time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right, and thank you, gentlemen. Coming up at 6 is our news. I am Sandra Ezekwesili.
Hard Facts will be right back.